Welcome to GS Podcast number 92, brought to you by Audible. Audible is the leading supplier of audiobooks online, and as a listener of this podcast, that entitles you to a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook that you can keep forever, even if you decide you no longer want to go ahead with their services. My personal recommendation would be to check out Ali A. Rizvi's new book, which is out now, called The Atheist Muslim. He came on the podcast quite some time ago, actually probably over a year, to talk about this book and the planning stages of it. It's out now, and I was fortunate enough to receive a advance copy some time ago. I've read it cover to cover, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's really good. Blends a lot of his personal experience in and his background, growing up as a Muslim, and then his transition to an ex-Muslim. But it's also right on the nose in terms of current day big issues surrounding this debate, such as reform, such as the regressive left, and he has a really engaging way of writing that keeps you, I want to say entertained, it's not quite the right word, but it's pleasurable to read, yet he manages to do this without dumbing down the big ideas. So I do know there's an audio version on Audible of it at the moment, so that would be my recommendation if you want to get a free audiobook. And I'll hopefully be speaking to Ali again before this month's out, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast via your preferred player, and hopefully that'll arrive before December. Some of you may have noticed that I ventured into the murky world of YouTube as well, and I'm quite enjoying it. There's something nice about being able to give information using visuals. I think it's definitely something I'm going to keep at and improve at, hopefully. But for those of you who haven't seen this, if you head over to youtube.com/gspellchecker, you can subscribe there and watch some of the videos I've made. I've put 2 up so far. One, a review of Ray Comfort's movie The Atheist Delusion, which is it's terrible. I think my video review is actually better than the movie, so make sure you check that out. And also, this time of year I get a lot of emails and messages about the Christmas shoebox charity appeal. People kind of know there's something off with it but can't quite remember what's wrong with it. So I put a video together just to highlight 3 reasons why you may wish to avoid supporting the Christmas shoebox appeal. But I will still keep concentrating on the podcast. I love this audio format. I love the fact I can speak to somebody across the Atlantic Ocean wearing my Batman pajamas. It really works for me, and I love the fact that people can listen to it on the move as well. So I'll still be doing my best to bring you excellent new guests on the podcast throughout the new year, and hopefully December we'll have some great guests as well. You can help support my podcast and YouTube efforts by becoming an official patron at patreon.com/gspellchecker. I'll be speaking to Larry T. Decker on today's episode. Larry's the Executive Director for the Secular Coalition for America, and it's quite an important episode. We're going to be discussing how secularism looks and the big issues most secularists seem to be concerned about, such as abortion, LGBT rights, etc. Larry's going to talk about how that may be affected by the Trump presidency. I recorded this episode with Larry several days ago, so I think there have been some new appointments and developments I mean this is usually Trump updates and developments usually come in hourly, but so yeah, there's been a few appointments and other things we may not have touched on in this episode, but interesting time ahead. I think the election of Trump caught a few people off guard. I was definitely one of them. I think the smart move would just to be stop having expectations where politics is concerned from now on. Nothing seems to make sense anymore. So I do know that the Secular Coalition for America are doing a great job not only to preserve and defend secularism in America, but to advocate for it where it's not as it should be. So most people who listen to my show will probably say they're secularist and quite passionate about it, but we don't all have the knowledge or the time to be activists in this regard, which is why I think it's important to support where you can the secular organisations. I support a number of secular organisations based in the UK financially. I give a little bit each month, and that really does add up and that really does help. If you can't give anything financially, consider joining their newsletters, spreading their campaigns on your social media. Just try and give them a signal amplification where you can. So head over to secular.org. That's the website for the Secular Coalition for America. Have a look at their campaigns. and consider supporting them, becoming a member, doing anything you can just to help them advocate for secularism. Larry's a great guy and I really enjoyed speaking to him. If you want to send him some love, some kind words, some feedback, maybe you've got some questions for him, he's on Twitter at LTDecker. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy!
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took across the God of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those who don't know what it means. And he said, it goes A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we know, speak to W. And he keeps telling them things that God let's say. A reason shoppers at night will make them run away. But if they start that fight, well, they can go all day. Spell check it, easy, got to spell check it. Now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, 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 A-T-H-E-I-S-T.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Larry T. Decker, Exec Director for the Secular Coalition for America. Welcome to the podcast, Larry. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
It's my pleasure. I was a little bit worried. I thought maybe there's not much going on in the States. I'm not sure how we're going to fill an hour. Any news stateside?
Yeah, I think we've had a few things happening over the last couple of weeks. So I think that we have plenty to talk about.
Sure.
I can't say it's all great and wonderful, but it's certainly things that your listeners will be interested in hearing, and certainly our community at large has a lot here at stake going into the incoming presidency of Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, I think that's an understatement, isn't it? Maybe before we delve into the ramifications of the new president-elect, maybe you could tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to be working for the Secular Coalition.
Well, it's an interesting story. I started looking at this job. I started the job, I should say, on December 29th of this past year. So I'm in about month 11. And it's been a wonderful ride. I mean, I have to say, I'd actually really thought about just leaving DC for good. And then this job came across my desk, and, looking at it and understanding the secular community and getting to know the secular community, I recognized that this would be by and far the most important work I ever do in my life. And I couldn't help but apply for the job, fight for the job, and before the board of directors, vetting one another, making sure that we were a good fit. And I have to say, I'm quite pleased with the progress that we've made over the last 11 months. And I think that, certainly we have a lot of work to do over the next 4 years. So I joke with people, though, and I like to say that, I turned 40 last year. I'm now 41. And I wanted to do something easy for the second half of my life. And of course, there's nothing easy about this, but it is important, and it's really good work. And I'm really proud of the team that we have at the Secular Coalition for America and the work that we do every single day in state capitals and in Washington, D.C., fighting for the secular rights and the foundation of what our country is actually founded on.
Yeah, you certainly came aboard at an interesting time. So, I mean, in terms of secularism, it can mean a fair few different things to different people. We have a few different definitions in Europe, for sure. I think France considers it a different way than perhaps England would, and probably different from America. So how does the Secular Coalition for America define secularism? What's its goal in that respect?
Well, I mean, we essentially have two definitions for it. One, you can be a secular Christian, you can be a secular Jew, you can be a secular Muslim. If you respect the separation of church and state, if you recognize that that in a secular democracy like we have, that religion really should not play a role whatsoever in the making of public policy. But of course, secularism has been also overtaken by the religious right to essentially mean that you're anti-God. And I don't think that any of us are here to fight religion. We're here to fight for religion not being influenced on us in our public policies, in our way of government, in the way that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution protect individual Americans. So I kind of define secularism two ways, and that's the way we look at it also from the standpoint of the Secular Coalition for America. I truly think that, the definition, a lot of definitions in America have been overtaken by the religious right, and one of our goals is to really take back what the true definition of these words mean. Religious freedom is not the way that the religious right in this country defines religious freedom. Religious freedom would look much different if it were, actually the true definition of what real religious freedom looks like. So we have some work there to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to stem back as well, really, to a lot of people not being overly familiar with the fact that the fathers were a kind of a mix of religious, deist, non-religious, but they all agreed or seem to agree on secularism. And why is it, do you think, that's not as prominent a fact of the Constitution that people like to cheer about in America as, say, the Second Amendment?
Well, and I've often actually said that isn't it interesting that our country was founded by breaking from England and, over religious freedom. And today, I think that England is much more religiously free than we are. There's been any number of things that have happened over the course of the last 40 or 50 years, with the religious right and in this country. And one of the big ones, essentially is that as we've made progress as a people, the Supreme Court decision to make marriage equality the law of the land, Roe versus Wade, as we've made progress through our legislatures and through the courts, there has been this undenying cry from the religious right that they're being persecuted. And for whatever reason this year, it had its, essentially its second epic, if you will, and it's disturbing because, we can look at any point in history and look at what real persecution of religious individuals look like. And it's not, making marriage equality the law of the land, and it's not, providing for access to reproductive health care. I look at religious people all the time and I say, if you don't like abortions, don't have one. If you don't like same-sex marriage, don't marry someone of the same gender. It's pretty simple, ultimately, but in a democracy that is protected by inalienable rights that have been enshrined in our Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, we cannot privilege one religion over another, and we ought not to. This is very much about freedom of and freedom from, and that's what we advocate for, the freedom from part. We just want to live in a society where legislators are making decisions based on science and evidence and things that actually matter, and not making decisions based on their own religious privilege and their own religious ideology.
Yeah, okay. So, in terms of before we had this election decision, which I think caught most people off guard. It certainly caught me off guard, and I would pretty much say the UK in general. Were there any candidates that you found noteworthy for their friendliness towards the idea of secularism? Because it seems like a really difficult topic to get on the political slate, really, doesn't it? No one seems to want to engage in it. No one seems very happy to be thought of as the secularist for reasons you've already outlined. Being associated with being anti-God or anti-religious. Was there any candidate you thought was more favorable than the others in that respect, though? Well,
I'll take them kind of one by one if I may. Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont certainly has been a champion and a great friend to the secular community. He deep understanding of the Constitution and the Establishment Clause, and he's just an all-around great human being. I was, and I think the majority of the secular community was very upset when we found out that the Democratic National Committee, in fact, wanted to use his socialism and his and his potentially being an anti-theist against him, that violated, essentially the core of who the Democratic Party is. And if you look at the demographics, I mean, I think it's important to point out that we are the largest, meaning the non-religious, are the largest religious demographic of the Democratic Party. We outnumber evangelicals, we outnumber Catholics, we outnumber Protestants, we outnumber minority faiths in this country. And I think that, we saw a number of top-level people at the DNC have to resign, essentially because of the controversy. And quite frankly, I think they should have. So I don't have a problem with that. I am upset, though, that our party, the Democratic Party, would, essentially betray the trust of the American people and try to make that an issue. Secretary Clinton has always been very strong on, despite her personal beliefs and her profound public, explanation of who she is and that she's a Methodist and that her faith is very important to her. Here at the convention back in July, she said, very openly, I believe in science. She referred to our national motto as being E pluribus unum, essentially the original national motto before in the 1950s during communism when we adopted In God We Trust. Her running mate, Tim Kaine, also, very well known for being a Jesuit Catholic, but someone who, without prompting, without having to ask him to do it, talks about the religious and the non-religious in the same breath. And, that was all very overwhelming for us, because we've had the most historical access to the White House and to the administration under President Barack Obama. And I think that a lot of us in the secular community were looking forward to maintaining that same kind of relationship with a Clinton-Kaine ticket and administration. And, we're left with Donald Trump, who, the president-elect really has not overstated his religion. But he did make a big point, and this is where I think we come down on looking at how we look at potentially. We look at candidates. We look at people elected to office. Essentially, is where's their policy going? And his policy doubled down for the religious right. Talking about everything from repealing the Johnson Amendment to appointing anti-choice and anti-equality justices to the Supreme Court, to signing something called the First Amendment Defense Act, which has nothing to do with defending the First Amendment, to creating school vouchers, so taxpayer dollars are going to religious schools, and even to something as simple but very symbolic as saying that we will make the United States one nation under God. We have no idea what that vague statement or where it's leading. But in the selection of his running mate, Vice President-elect Mike Pence, we have plenty of history on this guy. He has not been friendly to the causes that we support, nor has he been friendly to secular Americans, writ large. I mean, I look at He's akin to someone like Senator Ted Cruz, who says, I'm a Christian first, an American second, a conservative third, and a Republican fourth. I don't want someone who is a heartbeat away from becoming the president of the United States, putting their faith above our Constitution. And unfortunately, that's what we're looking at right now when January 20th and the swearing in and the oath of office take place.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult with Trump because he's very much the popularist candidate, and it's difficult to know what he actually thinks, if indeed he does. But he seems to say things just to please one area of the community, like you mentioned, the sort of the evangelicals. But on the other hand, I have heard him speak up and pledge to defend the rights of LGBT individuals, yet he will then go and appoint someone like Pence, who is very hostile to that community, to say the least. So
exactly.
how much of an effect do you think this is going to have on Donald Trump's candidacy in terms of the people who he's surrounding himself with?
Well, I think we're already seeing that take shape, Stephen. The appointments that were made this past week, National Security Director, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, a senator from Alabama, who has a sketchy past in terms of things that we care about, and the fact that Vice President-elect Pence is now leading the transition, and he has the closest ear to the president. I mean, the appointment of Steve Bannon from Breitbart News, I think that sends shockwaves to a lot of people in progressive communities. It certainly does ours. I do want this president to be successful, but also going to keep a very vigilant and mindful eye on what's going on in the Trump administration.
Okay, I mean, there's been these ideas floated around. A few prominent members of sort of the atheist movement as well have touched on them. This idea that Donald Trump actually is the first atheist president. How much truth do you think there is to that claim?
Well, I think we probably have had atheist presidents in the past. I don't know if Donald Trump is an atheist or not, and I'm not going to. He says that he's a Presbyterian. He's talked about his religion. I'm not going to question him on that. What I am going to question him on, and what I'm going to really look at, is whether or not he is a president for all people in this country. And if he upholds the foundational elements of the First Amendment. I mean, I think our founders, for all of his talk about, interpreting law the way that it was originally prescribed, then, he's got some work to do, and he has to prove to our community that he will and that he can effectively be a president that represents all of us.
Okay. I mean, you touched on before about the response to say communism was to entrench more into the Christian ideology, and I was wondering, maybe because I think Trump definitely profited from the increase in Islamic attacks around the world and the ones that took place in America, whether or not we're going to see maybe a repeat of this in terms of America digging down in Christianity a bit more because it sees this as the opposition to this Islamic threat.
Well, I think from the standpoint of the religious right, which is a social political movement that's been ongoing in this country for any number of years, and even though we had some good successes, and we recognize that the vast majority of Americans do not agree with the religious right on issues that are important to us. They agree with us, and I think secular values are more American, quite frankly, than I think religious values are American. With that said, though, I can guarantee you that the religious right in this country, conservative Republicans in this country, they all feel very empowered and very much pumped up from the election results. I mean, they now control the United States Senate, the House of Representatives, and the White House. And there's no way that I can stress enough that we've already seen bills that President-elect Trump has talked about, on the campaign trail, repealing the Johnson Amendment, which we can talk more about in a few minutes if you'd like. Appointing pro-life justices to the Supreme Court. We've already seen stuff like this happening and start to percolate on Capitol Hill. And while everything's going to have to be reintroduced in the next session of Congress, because we're seating a new Congress, the fact remains that the Tea Partiers, the extreme right, the alt-right, the nationalists, they feel very much empowered by this election. And that means we have a lot of work to do, because that means the religious right is going to double down on everything they've been trying to do, everything from creating bills like the First Amendment Defense Act, creating religious exemptions, creating opportunities for discrimination based on their own personal religious beliefs, in a democracy, which is wholeheartedly unfair, and it's antithetical to to who we are as a nation. So yeah, it started as a movement against communism back in the 1950s. It's really elevated itself. We thought it was dying down, but every time they lose, and this time they buckle back and they go and they attack our issues. I think that we're going to have a real assault on women's reproductive health. I think a real assault on race across the country. I think we're going to have a real assault on LGBTQ issues. And I say that as an openly and proud gay man. And I think that, we just got work to do.
Yeah. So circling back to the Johnson Amendment, then, I've always been really fascinated in the way in which money influences American politics and campaigning, and how much of that influenced candidates' decisions. So, if you could explain to us maybe what the Johnson Amendment is and what that would mean if it was reversed.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The Johnson Amendment was essentially put in place in the 1950s, and it stated that nonprofit organizations that have a 501c3 designation under the IRS tax code could not endorse political candidates and could not be engaged in, direct lobbying and direct advocacy work regarding elections. A repeal of this, and again, two bills have already been introduced in Congress, which I find to be fascinating. One would allow for all 501c3 organizations to be exempt from this. The other would allow for churches specifically to be exempt from this. And, you have to understand, under the IRS code currently in the United States, churches have a significant position over most nonprofit organizations because they don't have to file the long form IRS Form 990. Instead, they file a short form. They give very little information. It's basically a registry with the IRS and nothing more. They have no accounting and no reason to be transparent in their accounting of their revenues and of their expenses, where the money comes from, how they're spending it. Essentially, a repeal of the Johnson Amendment would effectively create a lot of dark money from churches because they already have no transparency and they have no regulation that requires them to be transparent in the political system, and that's very scary. If you think about it, we're talking about religious organizations that could, in effect, have no oversight, but yet they're funneling hundreds of millions and billions of dollars a year through religious organizations that could end up in the political system without any kind of transparency. So it's a very frightening thought. We combat private money in the political system as it is already. But now we'd be talking about private money that's coming from, directly from religious organizations. And the other thing it would do is it would allow for these independent expenditures. So we're talking about a great deal of money throughout the political system, ultimately. And we're also talking about zero transparency. That's the real scary part about all of this.
Right. How soon could he go about repealing something like that? And what would be the process? Would this have to go in front of Congress? Is this something he can just decide on his own? How would it work, and how soon could he do it?
So very early in next year, before the president is inaugurated, our new Congress will be seated. The 115th Congress will be seated. It typically happens on the first Tuesday after the first of the month. I don't know that the date's been set yet, but we're talking about, a handful of new members of the House of Representatives, as well as a handful of members of the United States Senate. With that said, it just happens. Members of Congress will introduce or reintroduce, in this case, pieces of legislation. The Republican House and the Republican Senate leadership, they will create the schedule by which bills will be passed or will be brought to the floor for a full vote. This could happen within weeks, essentially. It could happen, the Congress could pass a repeal of the Johnson Amendment and have it ready for President Donald J. Trump on January 20th. They could do that. This is something that's extremely concerning for us, and saying that, that churches have a right to endorse candidates, yet they don't have to be transparent. This is scary. It was probably one of the top one or two issues for the religious right and for the religious community throughout this campaign cycle.
Okay, and what can regular citizens do to voice their concerns about this? What's the best way to respond to the idea that this could be repealed when Donald Trump takes office?
Well, I mean, the best and number one thing that citizens can do is to reach out to their members of Congress and say, don't let this happen. There is a significant reason why this should not happen, and that there's concern over it happening. I have any number of members of Congress every single year say to me, "I don't have atheists in my constituency," and I'm like, "Really? I bet you do." But I mean, if we are not more vocal, and it goes to a really good point, Stephen, actually, that the non-theist community can no longer be spectators in politics. We have to be engaged. We have to dig down. The religious conservatives are outvoting us easily 2-1. But even as our numbers are growing, you would expect that voter turnout would grow. You would expect that more engagement in the political system would happen. It's not happening. And, we kind of fell on this election. We failed here. And we need people at this point to be as engaged as they possibly can, get to know their legislators, get to know their House of Representative members, get to know their senators, reach out to them, express your frustration and your concern over this particular bill, and be vocal. We've got to go back to American democracy 101, quite frankly. We see a lot of political protests taking place since the election returns came in. I think that there's a real nature of fear in this country, and complacency is not going to abate the fear. So the best way to be empowered is to be vocal, be engaged, tell them who you are, and tell them why it concerns you. That's the best thing that we can hope for.
Okay, well, I wanted to take a moment to speak about abortion, because it's one of them topics that, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly is a religious hot topic. It seems to be the religious organizations that want to influence policy on this the most. And Donald Trump's had some very mixed messages on the issue. I seem to remember a while back, and I think you'll know more than me, but he seemed to imply that he would make abortion illegal. And before I'd really had time to get angry about it, he seemed to have backtracked a little bit, so it's difficult to pin down what his views are, and maybe you could shed a bit more light on this for me.
Well, I wish I could. I think I'm as much in the dark as the next person in terms of what he actually feels in his heart. A few years back when he was a Democrat, before he became a independent, he was a Democrat, then he became a Republican, then he became an independent, and now he's a Republican again. His views have vacillated in terms of what he said in the public sphere. Here's my only thing I could actually say about this. Nearly 80%, 79% of Americans support legal access to abortion. 8 out of 10 Americans support legal access to abortion. I hope that they remember that they support legal access to abortion when we get his first Supreme Court nominee. And I hope that they're vocal if that particular individual is someone who has passed the litmus test that he said he would impose on judges to ensure that they are pro-life, and that there's a backlash. Now, I know that there's a lot of skepticism over the way that Democrats filibustered and ultimately denied the appointment of Justice Bork back in in the early 80s. But, the Supreme Court is essential. Think about it this way. Congress can pass laws, pass legislation. The United States and governors across the country are complied to enforce those laws. And the final arbitrator, though, is the Supreme Court after it goes through the court process. There could be nothing more important to this community than, having justices that are both qualified, but also have an understanding of the Constitution. It protects the First Amendment, it protects the Establishment Clause. I don't care what their personal politics are. They could be, tax-cutting conservatives. I don't have a problem with that. I care about how they are going to interpret laws to ensure the widest breadth of individual liberties, civil rights for Americans. That's what I care about, and that's what I'm going to be looking at. And, candidate Trump has said a lot of different things on women's reproductive health. He said that he's going to defund Planned Parenthood. For your listeners who don't understand the issue or haven't really focused on the issue, what that means essentially is that he's going to take away Medicare and Medicaid benefits all they are reimbursements. So if I had to go have a pap smear, I could do it at the Planned Parenthood. And if I'm on Medicaid, then the federal government would reimburse that Planned Parenthood for my pap smear. Or I could go to my local clinic or a local hospital and have it done. We don't spend federal money on abortion in this country. There's been a long-standing resolution that's been passed by Congress that states that we cannot spend federal taxpayer dollars on abortion. So this whole controversy over Planned Parenthood is, it's in and of itself just one more example of misinformation being spread across the political spectrum and the American populace that, is talking about issues that they're not valid, they're not true. So I wish I had more knowledge as to what Donald Trump, feels in his heart about abortion. I just, again, will say that we have to remain vigilant. We absolutely do.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone there in being confused by which direction Donald Trump leans. Yeah, sure, it's sketchy to say the least. I mean, I suppose that leads me to another point, which I'm not sure how much plays into what you do, whether it's on your radar, and it might be interesting to ask how it comes on your radar, really, but that's the issue of climate change. It's a big topic for everyone. Sure. It's a global issue. Donald Trump's comments on this are horrendous, to put it mildly. He's an outright proud climate change denier. I think he engages in some conspiracy theories about the Chinese being responsible for it. It's some sort of Chinese right. hoax, which is absolutely alarming, really. And I was wondering, is this something that's on your radar as a topic?
It absolutely is. I mean, we're not just looking at issues that have to deal with a specific integration of religion and politics. We're also looking at where science has overwhelming evidence. So, we talk about access to birth control. We talk about real sex education in our public high schools, as opposed to abstinence only. We talk about climate change. A few years ago, a United States senator brought a snowball, literally, into the Senate chamber and said, "Tell me the Earth is melting." That kind of hoax, that kind of just, showmanship. What are we doing? I don't get it, especially when we have so much evidence. And the thing that's more concerning to me than Donald Trump's own denial of climate change is that he appointed Myron Ebel to be to lead the EPA transition, the Environmental Protection Agency. This is, the watchdog agency to ensure that we have clean water, that we have clean air, that we're not harming our environment, that we are looking at the parts per million. I mean, scientists around the country know so much more about this than I do. But, this particular person, works as a coal lobbyist. He works for a libertarian think tank that's coal energy. And he's someone who's been very vocal about saying that I think that climate change, the whole issue around it, is a bunch of nonsense. He promotes clean coal energy, and he's leading up the EPA transition. So, we've made some significant progress over the last 8 years, and even some progress under the George W. Bush administration. I mean, he was a good president for a number of reasons, and I'm scared to say that the direction, the appointments that we've seen thus far go against science. They go against evidence, I certainly hope this guy doesn't get a senior appointment to the EPA, because that would be devastating for not just our country. This is where we're talking about global ramifications. We're talking about the impacts of bringing back coal, bringing back industries in our country that have helped to really decimate the climate over the last couple hundred years, and that will have long-lasting impacts, not just on the U.S., but certainly on the world.
Absolutely, yes. I suppose if we a change of focus, maybe we could have a look at how this might affect the progress that's been made in terms of LGBTQ communities, the distance that's been travelled just in the last 15, 20 years or so, and what are the dangers of a Trump presidency to the progress that's been made in that regard?
Well, I think that there might be a little bit more positive spin on this. First of all, and I'll go back to some basic facts. More than 7 out of 10 Americans believe that non-discrimination laws should be in place to protect LGBTQ people. We have seen a backlash, Stephen, I'm sure of this, over the past number of states regarding the Religious Freedom Protection Act, that allows for businesses and for individuals to discriminate against gay and lesbian people if they have a quote-unquote deeply held religious belief. I remember that when I was a Christian, that we were compassionate to one another, and that we're all God's children, right? I mean, until we're gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgendered. I think that Donald Trump has made clear that he is okay with the decision of the Supreme Court to allow gay marriage. But the thing that I have to go back to is look at who his vice president is. Mike Pence, as governor of Indiana, signed one of the most controversial religious privilege laws into effect. And it cost his state hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in business revenue, because Fortune 500 companies just pulled out left and right. The same thing happened in North Carolina with a transgendered bathroom bill that passed earlier this year. Americans aren't going to tolerate it. And if you look at the new research and the new studies out on the non-theistic community, the non-religious community in the U.S., one of the very top reasons that people leave churches, I mean, the top reason, of course, is that they just, they're not buying into the fairy tale. One of the second or third top reasons that people leave is because they don't agree with their church on LGBTQ issues. They think that all Americans should be treated fairly and equally and, have the right to marry. And, churches aren't there yet. So this is an issue that I think is going to prevail largely with the American people in terms of the actions taken by President-elect Trump and by Vice President-elect Pence. I think personally that we have a lot more concern. Again, as an openly gay man, I have a lot more concern about Pence than I do about Trump. I think President-elect Trump will actually protect my rights and ensure, fair equality for LGBTQ people. I hope that's the case. But one heartbeat away is Vice President-elect Pence.
Don't say it out loud, Larry. Don't say it out loud.
Right. But I certainly have no I have no ideation that this guy would protect the rights of LGBTQ people. He is, after all, a Christian first. So I don't know. It's a scary thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe you could tell me a little bit about what my listeners could do to support the Secular Coalition for America, where they can go and how they can get involved, and what are the areas you need the most support in?
Yeah, no, I'd be more than happy to do that. I mean, by and large, the number one thing that you can do is support us financially. I'm sorry to say that I would not be doing a good job as an executive director if I didn't do a fundraising push. And that means going to secular.org. There's a bright red button on the top right-hand page, that's the top right-hand section of the page that says donate, and you could go there and certainly support us in the work that we do. That's of the biggest concern for me going into 2017 is making sure that we have the resources we need to do the work that we need to do, quite frankly. Secondly, though, you can also sign up for action alerts at secular.org, which means that every time there is a bill or there is an issue at hand in Washington and or in the states, that you'll get an alert about it that would allow you to take action to write your legislator, governor, whomever it is. And, with that said, it's of also significant importance that we have people's voices out there talking to our legislators and making sure that they know that they have a constituency that is comprised of non-religious people that believe strongly in the First Amendment, believe strongly in separation of church and state, and believe strongly in the Establishment Clause. I think that I don't want to get off the phone with you, Stephen, though, without talking about some victories that we did have.
Excellent.
During this on election night. Evangelicals, this is not necessarily a victory, but it's a call to action for people like you and me. Evangelicals made up 27% of the voter turnout.
Oh, wow. So it's a significant portion.
Yeah, it's very significant. If you compare it to the non-religious, even though we outnumber them, we only made up 15% on the issues. A majority of Americans in this country support legal access to abortion, nearly 8 out of 10. They favor non-discrimination laws protecting LGBT people. That's 7 out of 10. 71% of Americans favor having non-discrimination laws to protect LGBTQ people. Nearly 70%, 67% of Americans believe religious employers should be required to provide birth control to their employees. Of course, that's been a big issue, a sticking point under the Affordable Care Act, otherwise affectionately known as Obamacare, for religious organizations. But nearly 70% believe that religious employers should be required to provide birth control to their employers. And more than 50%, 55% oppose using taxpayer money to pay for religious education. The reason I want to raise this, Stephen, is that on the issues, and I think it's important to point out, this was a change election. This was not an election on the issues. The majority of Americans favorably view the issues that we support. And I think it's a point worth making.
What do you think explains this sort of antipathy to the voting process then in terms of turnout?
Well, I think it's a frustration with the system in and of itself, that it's been, the last 40 or 50 years of just having the religious right really impose itself on our country that's made people dismayed, that their single vote's not going to make a difference. But in this election, their single votes would have made a difference. We have candidate Clinton leading candidate Trump by almost 2 million votes, and it's estimated that she will have won the popular vote by more than 2 million people in this country. The Electoral College, of course, went to President-elect Trump, and we respect the process, of course. But I mean, this is a point where individual votes mattered, and they mattered, to borrow a Trump term, bigly. So, I really hope, and we're focused on 2018 right now, the midterm elections, getting some significant wins in the House, getting some significant wins in the U.S. Senate. I really hope the non-religious community will join me and will join my colleagues in turning out the vote in 2018. We have an opportunity, Stephen. This is the big thing. We have an opportunity to be one of the biggest political movements in this country. But we can't do it if we're not talking about our issues through shared secular values of freedom, inclusion, equality, knowledge, things that most Americans can say, yeah, you know what, I agree with that. I just hope that secular Americans, non-religious Americans, even secularly religious Americans will join us because we have an opportunity to really turn the wave on this. But we did have some other significant victories that I do want to mention. In Colorado, we had more than 2/3 of voters supported end-of-life options, which is death with dignity. It was a ballot initiative to legalize aid in dying for the terminally ill. Millions upon millions of dollars were spent by religious groups opposing the measure, and we prevailed. So I think that, like abortion and like LGBTQ equality, the most significant detractor in aid in dying in this country has been the Catholic Church. And, to have that victory is really great. In Oklahoma, Trump won 65% of the vote, but 56% of voters rejected a ballot initiative that would have allowed taxpayer money to be used for religious purposes. That's significant. And quite frankly, I will not tell you that I wasn't surprised. I was actually surprised we won that ballot initiative. We had 11 openly secular candidates who won at the state level on election night. 9 were elected to state houses, 2 to state senates. That's also significant. And I think it's important that secular Americans recognize that we have people who are out there on the front line being open, saying, I will not tolerate the religious litmus test to become an elected official. I'm out. I'm openly secular. I'm an atheist. I'm a humanist. I'm agnostic. I don't believe in God. I'm running for office, and this is why you should vote for me. And 11 of them won on election night, which is not insignificant. It's actually quite significant. So we have some good things that we can point to, and we have an action plan going forward. We were prepared for either a Clinton victory or a Trump victory. I think that we were surprised, quite frankly, in the outcome, as I think most of your listeners probably are. And either on the air or offline, I'd love to hear what people in Europe are saying about this.
You wouldn't. You wouldn't.
From Europe. I don't want to hear. Okay. Probably a lot of the same. But no, we are committed to working with the Trump administration and continuing to build on the foundations of what our country was determined to be, secular democracy, and one that does not promote any religion over any other, or none for that matter. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we'll get there.
Yeah, plenty of concerns, but plenty of victories, like you say, a lot to be optimistic about. So I can only really wish you and the American people good luck. I kind of see Americans as my cousins. I do love the country, so I really hope that we have a lot more positive things to talk about if we get a chance to catch up again, Larry. But I want to thank you for coming on and sharing all this information with me.
That's absolutely my pleasure, and I'm happy to join you whenever you will have me. Feel free to call anytime.
Thank you very much to my excellent guest, Larry T. Decker. Make sure you check out secular.org and consider supporting them. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. I think we've all learned something here today.